Olá, pessoal, bom dia. Eu sou Vitor Santiago, professor de Letras, Inglês e Literaturas na Universidade Federal do Acre. E hoje nós temos a honra de termos aqui no nosso programa de extensão L, coordenado pela professora Maísa Dourado, a professora Jeanne Dubino, que estará conosco por 3 dias consecutivos, hoje, amanhã e quinta-feira, com 3 temáticas diferentes. E hoje a professora vai falar um pouco sobre Animal Studies, os estudos, as fabulações dos animais na literatura. Bom, deixando claro para quem não acompanhou as nossas redes, a nossa aula será em língua inglesa. Então, por favor, interajam em inglês no chat para que a professora possa ter acesso. Mas, caso alguém tenha alguma dificuldade ou queira fazer alguma pergunta no chat, tenha dificuldade de formular, pode colocar em português, que eu vou fazer a tradução para a professora. Ok? So, let's go to English. So my name is Victor Santiago. I am a professor at the Federal University of Acre. And to start with, I would like to thank Maria Oliveira, professor at the Federal University of Paraíba, for making this happen. Thank you, Maria, for everything. It's an honor to have such a great professor here with us, Professor Jeanne Dubino. And I would like to thank Maísa Dourado, the coordinator of this extension program. Thank you, Maísa, for helping us with everything that was required to make this happen. And I would like to thank our students from Universidade Federal do Acre, from schools here in Rio Branco, and if you are from any other place. Oh, we have here Ana Carolina Mesquita is here with us too. Jeanne, Ana Carolina Mesquita is a very important translator of Virginia Woolf's diaries here in Brazil. We also have the presence of Professor Lauro Iglesias Quadrado from Federal University of Bahia. Thank you, Lauro, for being here. And a lot of students. Thank you so much for being here. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce you in Portuguese, Jeanne, okay, if you don't mind, and then the stage is going to be yours. Pessoal, Jeanne Dubino é professora de literaturas em inglês, estudos globais e estudos animais na Appalachian State University, na Carolina do Norte, Estados Unidos. Foi professora assistente visitante de literatura e história das mulheres na Bilkent University, Turquia, como uma pesquisadora da Fulbright na Egerton University, Quênia, como especialista Fulbright na Universidade do Nordeste da China e professora visitante na Universidade Ain-Shams, no Egito. Algumas de suas publicações mais recentes incluem a organização de Virginia Woolf and the Literary Marketplace e as co-organizações de Representing the Modern Animal in Culture, Politics, Mobility, and Identity in Travel Writing, Virginia Woolf Critical and Primary Sources, The Edinburgh Companion to Virginia Woolf and the Contemporary Global Literature, e War in Travel Literature, além de ensaios, artigos e resenhas sobre o Woolf, viagens e estudos animais. E atualmente trabalha em um livro sobre cachorros de rua na literatura. So, Jeanne Dubino, thank you so much for being here with us. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. I also want to pass my heartfelt thanks to Maria Aparecida Oliveira, who really is making this very possible. And what a pleasure to see Victor Santiago again. We're talking about animals, but not just about wolf and animals this time. And thank you all so much for being here. It's such a pleasure. And you're way out west in Acre, which I have been reading about. So anyway, perhaps next time. I do plan to come back to Brazil next year. All right, I'm ready for the PowerPoint. Okay, here is my initial slide. And again, more thanks to you all. So, oh wait, let's see. Let me control this. So let me first acknowledge the many critics who have informed my work. And you can see a fairly long list here, but also my 17 or so years of being in animal studies have made their way to this presentation. And one of the things I have found that students want to know, students in literary animal studies, is what are they? What can we do? So as I talk about the field of animal studies, I will also talk about literature. We are literary critics who look at the topic. What are we going to study? We look at the words, the language. How does the language shape the text that we're reading? We are very interested in form. We're interested in literary theory. And these are the parts of literary study that you know about, that you are used to. And then finally, we will look at how we go about it. So one of my favorite books on this list, it's not online, unfortunately, but Mario Ortiz Robles' Literature and Animal Studies, I find, is a very effective book. So if you want this list, just email me and let me know. In fact, I didn't put my email address there, but you can always, text Dr. Santiago. All right, so preamble, if we were sitting in an audience, I would ask you to tell me out loud, what is your favorite animal story? And here I would like you to reflect back even to your earliest years, your earliest memories, when you were 2, 3, 4, 5. What stories did you read about animals that made an impact on you? You may go later into your years. Has it shaped you? How did you feel about it? I mean, I know that one of my earliest animal memories was the film Bambi. Oh my goodness, such a sad film, and such a brilliant film too. A film that has certainly made its way into discussions about animal studies. So please keep that in mind as we begin, as I start. So here are the 5 parts to my presentation. Most of the presentation will be on the first 4, but I want to acknowledge the animals I have seen since I arrived in Brazil. Here are frigate birds. I believe they are called Pássaro de Frigata, whom I first met in Rio de Janeiro. And then this lovely Bemchivi, whom I have heard often, and sometimes when I'm waking up here in João Pessoa or Jampa, I was just taught, and I have also heard them when I was in Minas Gerais, so such a pleasure. And then I have seen beloved street dogs, stray dogs, cachorro. So let me acknowledge the non-human animals I have met. Some of them I have met since I have arrived. But anyway, I have 5 parts. The first one is why literary animal studies now, why in the last 20 years have they become popular? What are the different dimensions or parts of literary animal studies? What can they do? And you can see how I boldface some of the keywords in my category. How can we apply and use them? And what is the state of literary animal studies in Brazil? Sorry for the misspelling. I spelled it the US way. So why literary animal studies now? Here are the parts to this one. So I will look at the changes in literary studies, and you can reflect on this even as I'm talking. So there have been changes. There is an expanding circle of what and who matter. We are moving out of the prison house of language. There is an urgency in ethics, and we are living in the age of Darwin. So why now? Well, I believe that we in literary studies want to understand the creatures with whom we live, the non-human creatures, and that literature offers us a way into understanding them, right? Literature allows us to get into other spheres and imaginative worlds and other minds. And then next, given that animals are at the very origin of our systems of representation, we want to be conscious of those origins and the foundations on which literature is based. I believe we want to know why animals figure so prominently in literary text. Next, there is an expanding circle of what and who matter. One can compare literary animal studies to the rise of women's studies, or now gender studies, ethnic studies, disability studies, and in the US, increasingly migrant and refugee studies. So you know that if you've studied the history of literature, you know that until, at least in the West, the global North, the global West, and I know we're all part of the same hemisphere, the global West, but the kind of literature studied since the founding of literature departments at the beginning of the 20th century in many colleges were focused on literature by white men. Starting in the 1960s in the US, there arose the civil rights movement. And out of the civil rights movement, which were about granting rights in the US to African Americans, emerged the second wave of women's rights, and then ethnic studies. And I think about, in particular, I'm very interested in Asian American studies. That happened at the same time. And out of that came disability studies, which I will talk about tomorrow, and so on. Secondly, there is an increasing trend to grant legal rights and protections to non-human animals and also to non-human things, all right, like rivers, like mountains. So if some of you have read Gayatri Spivak, who is famous for popularizing the subaltern, she writes, "Can the subaltern speak?" The subaltern is that category of people, typically Pessoa, who are silent, who do not have rights. And so now animals are the new subaltern. And I suppose literary critics want to speak on behalf of animals. And then there are animal rights cases. For example, in that first picture here, Happy the elephant in New York City, there was a court case on whether or not he should have rights. And so I Googled what's the state of animal rights in Brazil, and currently there are debates about animal testing, and particularly on cosmetic testing of animals. Third, there is a desire to move out of what Frederick Jameson, who is still alive, still with us, who's 90 years old now, there's a desire to move out of the prison, what he calls the prison house of language, and I included the title of the front page of his book here. There is a desire to know that there are creatures with ways of knowing and being that resist our flawed systems of language. So even though we are a group of academics, and that includes all of us here who are interested in language, well, what do we do with creatures who do not have the kind of language that we do? Fourth, there's an urgency in ethics. Their lives affect us and ours affect them, all right? And so you can sort of see this concern about their impact on our lives, and think about COVID. We are pretty sure that's a zoonotic disease. That is, it's a disease that spreads to us humans. In fact, more than half of all pandemics originate in animals, zoonotics, and we certainly have an impact on them. One of the biggest impacts we have is the second bullet point, CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. This is an animal industrial complex driven by capitalism, which wants more and more people to eat the flesh of animals. And think about this, nearly 1 million cows are slaughtered every day to feed our growing appetite, non-human animals' appetite for beef, and over 202 million chickens are slaughtered every single day. So we have a deep impact on the animal world, but that's domesticated animals. We're also living in the world's 6th species extinction. The extinction rate is something like 100 to 1,000 times greater than it would be if we humans were not populating the earth. So even as the number of domesticated animals grows, the number of species is declining. And what's the big irony? That animal studies are growing even in the face of these disappearances. And so there's a growing consciousness of animals even as they are, except as pets and domesticated animals, and the animals we experiment on, they are no longer as visible in our lives. We finally are living in the age of Darwin. The Origin of Species was published 165 years ago. It decentered the human. Darwin reminded us that we too are animals. We are primates. That means that we are not much different from non-human animals. If you think about our DNA, we share about 95, if not higher, percentage of DNA as our fellow primates like orangutans and gorillas and so on. Carrie Roman writes that Darwin's Origin of Species delivered a catastrophic blow to human privilege vis-a-vis the species question. So the human is decentered. Right. Next, what are, all right, so these are some of the reasons why literary animal studies have become prominent. And so now let's talk about what they are. So I have several bullet points here, and I will expand upon each one in the coming slides. They bring animals to the foreground. They are the topic, right? They're about recognizing the way language constructs animals. They attend to form and genre. They work with theories and terminologies, especially anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, and they challenge existing practices and methods. So starting with bringing animals to the foreground, we look at them directly. We don't ignore them. We don't just just shunt them off or move them off to the margins. And we look at how literature uniquely represents them. And they become an independent topic of literary history, not just in how they relate to us humans, but all by themselves. And then secondly, when we're reading literature, we start to see how literature can be saturated with animal figures, including our language. I don't know what the expression in Portuguese is, but in English, we might say as hungry as a bear, or hungry as a horse, or hungry as a wolf. So we become aware of how language is filled with non-human animal references. And then we remind ourselves that literary animals are created by words. They are a literary invention. I'm going to talk more about metaphor. John Berger, who just died a few years ago, was a leading animal studies critic. And he reminds us humans are non-human animals, or rather human animals. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Or I guess hungry as a pig. All right. We don't use that phrase in English, but yeah, one eats like, we definitely say if someone is eating like a pig, that person is eating a lot. And actually, it's a big insult. I don't know if it is in Portuguese. Anyway, what are metaphors? Of course, metaphors compare two dissimilar objects. All right, they are tropes, they are figure of speech. And so they mediate our understanding of the topics that we are discussing, all right? And so getting back to metaphors, we might compare anger to a tiger, and then I had hungry as a horse. And in the US, this probably doesn't translate into Portuguese, happy as a clam, mollusco, and you might say that's kind of weird. I think it's because clams open up and they have those big circles. So you might have other kinds of metaphors, and you can see how specific to language animal metaphors can be. Right. And then you not only look at language, you look at at forms. One might start in animal studies with animal genres, and one of the big ones are fables. When I was doing a talk on fables earlier this year, I just wanted to get a sense of how of fables in English. And in the course of my research, I learned that almost all cultures around the world have fables that feature animals that are basically humans configured as animals. But those are not the only animal genres. There's the animal epic, there are animal tales. And then within literature, there are animal motifs. Dogs tend, because they are the first domesticated animal in apparently all of history, they tend to feature a lot in text. They tend to be considered to be faithful across many cultures. Apes, funny. Wolves, bad. They tend to be associated with evil, at least in the global north. And so we can start with a focus on the traditional fable, Or we could change our conception of all genres of literature and how we approach them. So one of them is, for example, the novel, and consider how novels experiment with narrative perspectives. I am primarily a Woolf scholar, and as I read Woolf, I realize how in my early years I skipped right over all the animals that are in her novels and her essays and her diaries and her letters. But of course, her most famous novel is Flush. And you can see how she's experimenting with the perspective of a dog. And we know that dogs, their most valuable sense is their nose. Our human's most valuable or important sense is through our eyes. We see so much through our eyes. Dogs' sense of smell is intensely greater than ours. So one critic calls Flush olfactory because Flush sees things or experiences the world through his nose. We work with traditional theories and dichotomies. Above all, we break down the boundary between humans and animals. And let me just give you an interesting factoid. So 1.5 kilos of all of us present and all of the more than 8 billion, I said 8 billion humans on this earth, more than a kilo and a half are not us. They are other creatures, bacteria, who live on our skin, who live behind our ears and in our nose and in our mouth and in our gut and between our fingers, between our toes. And what I find interesting, if we did not have these creatures living in and on us, we could not survive. But they are not us. So that is, we are not wholly human. All right. And what I find compelling is that 1.5 kilos is the same weight as our brains. Okay, anyway, what that means, I'm not really sure. But we also know that animals have what we would consider many human characteristics. Many mammals are intensely curious. Fishes who seem to have no personality at all, and I'm deliberately pluralizing the world, even though I'm breaking a grammatical rule, they are social beings. Think about that, all right? They care about each other. So we rethink these dichotomies, all right? The split world between subject and object. And we break down that dichotomy. The big word in animal studies is anthropocentrism. It's almost impossible not to put people, which is what anthropo means, not man, but people, at the center of the world. But we try to break that down just like Darwin did. And often we try to do that through anthropomorphism, again, people, and then shape. We might look at animals as a kind of people. And that's a way of relating to animals, of seeing them kind of like us. It's not a bad thing, but I'll talk about what are the good parts of anthropomorphism and what the good parts are. So moving along, because there's such an interest in terminology in animal studies, there are a number of glossaries. And I happen to actually have this gorgeous glossary online, Animal Studies, The Key Concepts by Matthew Collarco. If you are interested in it, email me, I'll send you my PDF. And then there are other glossaries that I list here that are also very good. These are just 3 of them. So yeah, how do we talk about this new way of talking about literature? What language do we use? David Herman is the go-to guy, the go-to person on the study of narratology. He has become keenly interested, very interested in animal studies. This book I cannot find online, but he is someone who believes in open access. So you can find many of his articles online if you just Google his name and narratology. But what is narratology? It's about how a story gets told. It focuses on the narrative, the role of characters, how thought is represented. It focuses on what Herman calls story worlds, or the worlds projected by narrative text and inhabited by the agents, non-human as well as human, with which a given narrative is concerned. So if you look at storytelling in animal life, you think about the story beyond the human, how ideas developed by scholars of narrative bear on questions about nature and scope of human-animal relationships in the larger biosphere, all right? the world not just of us humans, but of animals and vice versa. And here's an example of one by Laura Brown, who, oh, this slide didn't quite work, but in her book, I heard her read earlier this year, The Count Imaginary Earthquakes, Lapdogs, and Traveling Coinage, all right, making up language, in 18th century literature. Here's a blurb of the book on the other side, the back page, on the way this book proposes that alongside the historical, social, institutional structures of human reality that seem to be the sole subject of the literary text, an other than human world is everywhere in evidence. So narratology is about paying attention to that other than human world. All right. And then what do literary animal studies do? They challenge existing practices and methods. We become more attentive to the text. We don't just look at the human that's there, the human animal, but the non-human animal. We look at contradictions. I think that literary animal studies has definitely made me a better and closer reader, and that's what we want to do. We want to pay attention to the text, and then we also want to look at how aesthetic and literary questions regarding animals are interwoven with both political and material spheres. A book that I love is by Ruth Ozeki, who is a Japanese-American writer who wrote a novel, My Year of Meats, which is about a film maker who can't find work as a filmmaker. So she hires herself out to a meat company that wants to advertise meat. And so she makes a series of documentaries that are about trying to create a desire for beef among Japanese audiences. And so this book is about not just about animals and cows, but about the intersection of that, and I'll talk more about intersectionality with capitalism, with American culture, the US's love of guns, and so many other things. And then Tom Van Doren's Flight Waves, which the life and loss at the edge of extinction, is about 5 stories of 5 different birds, and he looks at the way they story their own worlds. So we look at how animals create stories, right? And then literary history is literary theory is also interested in literary history. So you know how literature often arises, and I saw that this is true of Brazil when I was looking at the history, when I was reading books about the history, that the history or literature often starts as a way of justifying the nation state, creating the nation state. So Ortiz Robles says that rather than looking at the way literature is connected to the history of nations, we look at migrations. I just read a few chapters from Sonia Shaw's The Next Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move. And here she is. Here's the front cover of her book. And she writes about the way that we humans and many of the species with whom we live on the earth are essentially and inherently migratory. We're always moving. So instead of looking at migration, history of nations, look at migrations. And then we in literature, especially as literature teachers, are very interested in getting our students to be mindful of the different genres like novels, poetry, drama. But Ortiz Robles suggests that we look at types like animals. So we categorize text in different ways. And Genera refers to the different ways one categorizes animals. We also categorize and lump literature into different languages. And Ortiz Robles says, why not look at biomes? That is, the different spheres in which animals live. And rather than look at separate texts, look at taxa, another form of categorizing animals. So you can see how literary animal studies is getting us to think about literature itself in new ways. All right, sorry, that was what my last category was, what are literary animal studies, and here is what they can do. So what can they do? And so I've got 6 categories here. See animals as subjects, what they could be. They get us to see the world of the animal, and I'm running through this because I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. They get us to see humans as ourselves, how animals and humans are intertwined or convolution, and they, again, question the boundaries between animals and humans. And you can see some overlap here, and that's okay, all right? get the point through. So animals as subjects. So what does it mean to see someone as a subject? It means to see that person or that being as a whole entity. Now, people who work with animals have different perspectives of them. The ecologist might see an animal as part of a larger biome or as part of a larger ecology or ecosphere. All right, but not the animal, the individual animal, as a being in and of herself, himself. A farmer will see animal as food, all right, not the entire being, although of course some do. A shoemaker is focused on the skin, the leather. So literature can tell us something about animals, something that we might prefer to ignore, namely that they're entire entities, whole beings who have subjectivity. We are so inclined to lump animals into one big category. Literary animal studies get us to see individual animals, just like literature gets us to see individual creatures. And so the point that Ortiz-Robles makes is that the literary has more to say about animals than other discourses, and something that other disciplines won't. For example, that cows have a lot of personality. Next, what can they do? They can give us access to the animal. So there's a very famous essay, you can find this online, by the US philosopher Thomas Nagel, who asked, what is it like to be a bat? And now he says, it's impossible. You can't imagine as a human being what it's like to be a non-human being. That's his argument. However, there are many who have since argued against this idea that he brought up 50 years ago. The literary imagination is all about trying to get us, especially writers, to see worlds that are not there and to admit what we do not fully understand. The literary imagination is, in a sense, inherently about science fiction, about imagining other worlds. Like, I can't possibly know what even the person closest to me, like my husband, I can't know what he's thinking all the time. I can only imagine what he's thinking. And of course, the longer I live with him, it's been a long time, but I can imagine more and more. But what literature can do is get us to think and feel and see as an animal does. We can develop a new way of seeing in the world. We can also imagine what it would be like to see something that isn't there. That's called the counterfactual. And in imagining another kind of space, we might think about how human and animal relationships might develop differently. And some of the idealists, like me in the room, might say that we could stage a transformation of our relationship and our relations to other species. What could our relationships with animals be like? All right. And we do that through the counterfactual. We can also, through literature, imagine what it's like to be an animal through their Umwelt, a German word, another phenomenal world. Or we could imagine a shared Umwelt, a place of intersection between our worlds, this space here, what Giorgio Agamben calls, he born in 1942, the open, the space in between. And a recognition of this space can broaden the scope of life writing. Herman, in his narratology book, writes about a trans-species context, this one here, which reveals the extent to which life writing becomes entangled with the broader endeavor of writing life. We can see ourselves. If you look at origin myths, many of them are about how humans describe themselves as not animals. They are about separating animals from humans when the two were blurred. And then when you study origin myths, you can consider what role animal transformation has played in our understanding of being human. There's also an interest in looking at how texts represent the animality that resides both within the non-human and animal worlds. And so if you look at animality in the human worlds, think about how humans can be represented as animals. That's called zoomorphism, right? Just as animals represented as humans are about, animals looking like humans. Zoomorphism is about humans as animals. This zoocentric view of literature might get us to be more aware of what we might traditionally call our own animal natures. Literary animal studies are about looking at the way animals and humans are intertwined. Gary Marvin and Susan McHugh, she's on my list of writers whom I consulted specifically for this, but certainly I know Gary Marvin's work. He's done incredible work in the world of bullfighting and hunting. He's brilliant. They're all brilliant. Anyway, they make the case for human animal studies rather than just animal studies because we've so deeply been configured and intertwined in each other's worlds. We have emotional bonds often with we human animals, with our non-human animals. Edwards and others in their introduction talk about the way humans and animals have been involved and twisted together. And they say rather than look at evolve together, we convolve together. All right. So our lives are so imbricated with one another, we can't just separate them out. And Donna Haraway is the one who's really famous for talking about becomings that involve human and non-human beings. And to that end, I just thought that I would show 3 slides to look at a series of books that were written at the time. You can tell I've actually written a lot about Flush, a favorite book of mine, my favorite dog book of all time. But at the time Woolf wrote Flush, she said, "Oh, there are so many dog books out there. Why should I write another one?" And I thought, is she right? Were there a lot of books about dogs? And yes, there were at the time that Woolf wrote Flush, and she would have known about some of them. One of the most famous is Beautiful Joe, which kind of started the trend. Beautiful book. You can easily find that one online. But they're about the lives that humans and dogs have shared together. And I've read a bunch of these. They're pretty interesting, and many of them are online. So I'm just showing you many book covers so you can get a feel for that. For all of us visual learners, like this one was a very popular one, Pierrot, Dog of Belgium. All right. And then here are some more. Okay, just so you can visualize for all the visual learners of us here. All right, and then literary animal studies. I've already said what they are, but what they do, they break down this boundary between human and animal and remind us that thought, consciousness, language are not humans' exclusive property. Ethologists refer to people who study animal behavior. So literary animal studies push humans and animals toward indistinction and multiplicity, which is a good thing. Some might say that they are inherently queer. All right. They fit that definition. So final category is, how can we apply and use literary animal studies? So we can think about animal representation, which is the first category, and I'll talk about that. We can look at, get back to metaphor, genre, and form in literary history, and we can consider theory and then the role of the reader in making meaning. So these are the broad categories. Let's get to the specific. What are some of the roles that animals play? What do they do in literary representation? How do these patterns shift? So you can look at, for example, is an animal like a dog represented as the companion? Is the dog the center, the protagonist of the book? What role might a worm play? Does the worm stand in for a human? Does the worm stand in for death? I mean, first, look at the animal and then look at the role that the animal plays, all right? And sometimes, as happens with human characters, the role of the animals shift, and so look for those shifts. And a big concern in animals and literary studies takes us back to anthropomorphism. And one of the biggest, most prominent, obvious forms of anthropomorphism is personification, where animals stand in for humans and they speak for humans. We see that in fables, and particularly, there are some people, I have a friend named Kim, who does not like personification. She doesn't like it when animals speak for humans. She says that feels artificial. But other critics say, No, we relinquish the dominion inevitably conferred to humans by the power to speak and name for. Let animals speak for themselves, and let those who are writing about animals speak for themselves. Give them that power. So again, look at the roles that they play, all right? And that's not so hard to do. Secondly, look at how they are represented. Consider what they may stand for, their symbolic function, or are they represented in realistic ways or in fantastic ways? Let's see, some of you may have stayed up on Sunday night to watch The House of the Dragon. Dragons are obviously fantastic animals based on dinosaurs. There's been such an interest in dragons. What role do they play? I have many students who are interested in dinosaurs, not fantastic animals, but animals who lived in the past, many of whom resemble fantastic. So look at the different role, look at the different kinds of functions that they play, and look at the narratives that they inhabit. Now, in modern literature, we may not think as much about animals. A survey was undertaken by Ortiz Robles, and in fact, his writing informs this slide. A survey was taken of contemporary modern literature that showed that often the literary animal is in the margins. That is obviously not true of all literature. If you go back to dog books and you go to Amazon, and let's say you want to read a book about people and their dogs, you will actually find hundreds of texts, right? And then Lundblad, Michael Lundblad, who's also in that list of writers I showed you, he says we could also focus on text with humans, all right? So even though we're talking about animals, we could look at text with humans. We could look at the way zoomorphic representations, how they are likened to animals, or humans who have animal characteristics, or who are oppressed like animals. And when I see that one, I often think of post-colonial literature, which looks at how the representation of animals and humans, how it's often been used to dehumanize people as animals. And so we can see how othered that kind of dehumanization, how that kind of othering takes place. Or you could look at animals signifying humans. So all kinds of possibilities there. Or you could look at the kinds of animals who are represented. Some animals are literary, others are not. The animals represented in literature tend to be those who are most closely related to us, the domesticated ones, like dogs, like horses. Right? Or we may feature those we hunt, or who hunt with us. Jack London is one of the most popular authors who are examined in literary studies because he's just so phenomenal. But we eat animals, like I told you, my year of meats is about that. We collect them. I just gave a paper on animals who are taxidermied, that is, they're killed, and then they're eviscerated, all of their insides are taken out, and then they're stuffed, and then they're preserved, right? So that's a form of collection. We may represent charismatic, that is, animals, people we are drawn to. Mega means large, fauna means animals, charismatic megafauna. We're not so interested in insects. Now, let me talk a little bit about insects. Insects tend to be regarded as pests. You can hardly drive down a street in the US without seeing trucks that are driven by those in insect control, pest control. And yet, what is happening in our age of the sixth extinction is that we are killing them off. In fact, some would say we are going through what is called Insectageddon or Armageddon. We are killing off so many creatures who are important on Earth. And not only that, but if you want to think about the difficulty of isolating one animal from other animals, it's especially hard to do that with insects. Even 2,000 years ago, when the Roman thinker and critic Pliny, P-L-I-N-Y, or Pliny, when he was writing about animals, he said, it is difficult difícil, it is very difficult, muito difícil, to isolate a single insect from other insects. So to that end, I thought I would show you an insect poem. This poem is by the US writer Monica Yoon, a writer I love. She actually started off as a lawyer and decided to quit and become a poet. So this poem was published more than 12 years ago in the New Yorker magazine. I have the link down here. And imagism refers to, the trope of imagery against, I suppose, featuring against a trope that many poets use. Poets are all about imagery. So I thought I would just have us read this poem about a firefly. In my travels so far, I have not seen a firefly in Brazil. There are many in the US. There used to be more, except that we are killing them off because we use so many pesticides in the US, especially with the rise of lawns. We use a lot of what is called Roundup, which is a pesticide that kills weeds and other bugs, and a terrible pesticide, very toxic, very carcinogenic, but widely used. So anyway, I have pictures that might help you kind of visualize the poem. In the third, I'm going to read the poem, but this word chitinous means the hard shell of an insect's body. This is what a firefly looks like, and they light up. See, you can see that here. When you're in the US and you see at night a landscape, you see this beautiful, beautiful picture of these bugs lighting up, like twinkling, like stars, twinkling stars. And Shazam is obviously a word from comic books. And here's a bug zapper that looks like a tennis racket. By the way, these bug zappers tend to kill, in the US, they do not kill the bugs they're intended to kill, which are mosquitoes. They kill good bugs. They're widely used. They're not very effective. All right, so these are the elements that appear in the poem, and let me read it out loud. Against imagism, late July, the wet and dry zones of a firefly's chitinous body fuse in a blue spark, a squash racket-shaped bug zapper, brand name Shazam. So we see the time of the year. It's late July. All right, just a sentence fragment, not a full sentence. This is a short poem, only 6 lines. The wet and dry zones, this is how it happens. There's this chemical reaction. Zones also makes us think of spheres of a firefly's chitinous body. Chitinous, hard, but it's no match against a bug zapper. Fuse in a blue spark, and there is this electrical energy that takes place. And then a squash racket-shaped bug zapper. We use these for games. It's almost like playing games with a bug, brand name Shazam. We can sort of see a dark humor here. It almost seems funny, but if you look at this from an ecological perspective, there's something sardonic, there's something harsh about this. There's so much that one can say. What are we doing? Is this sort of making fun of the way? I mean, again, so much one can say about a poem, and we can say more during the Q&A. But what are we doing to insects now? We kind of treat it like a game. And yet this is indeed a very beautiful creature, and this poem is about that. But it's also a poem that makes fun of the way that that might even make parodic the kind of art that poets undertake as they try to create imagery. Anyway, much that one can say about that. But let me now move into what ends our animals represented. Are they made to, in bad ways, are animals made to buttress or support human exceptionalism and domination? Is that what this last poem is about? Are they about reducing animals to things and being disrespectful? Or would you say that that poem undermined human exceptionalism and domination? Was this a robust and respectful poem, or did it make fun of this? So you can think about that, all right, to what ends. Or you could look at how the poem engages with the question of anthropocentrism. So one of the dangers of anthropocentrism is that it collapses the difference between animals and humans so that you fail to see the animals for who they are. All right, anthropocentrism can offer a false familiarity, like in cartoons, all right? You just completely overlook the fact that, in fact, this animal is an animal and not just a human being. Or can anthropocentrism allow us to access animals' behavior and emotion? Kari Weil promotes the idea of critical anthropomorphism. We can open ourselves to touch and be touched by others as fellow subjects, which is what anthropocentrism is. We can try to imagine their pain, pleasure, and need in anthropomorphic terms, but stop short of believing that we can wholly know their experience. And that's true of, even empathy too. We can try to imagine empathy toward humans, what other people are going through, but we can't ever really wholly know. All right. And we can anchor our statements by learning more about animals, their natural history, what their physiology is, their body is, what their nervous system is, what their history is. For example, dogs, we think we know dogs, but they're not primates, they're canines. We primates are used to encountering, imagine this is a face and this is another face, looking at each other head on. That's what primates do when they greet each other. But we know that dogs, all right, this is a dog, they greet each other sideways, all right? And they feel kind of threatened when you go up to them very quickly. So we can learn how to approach dogs. We know that they have a strong sense of smell. They don't like certain we know that we don't want to put scents on them. They don't like it. If you're going to give them a bath, avoid shampoos with scents. So you get to learn dogs as dogs and respect their doggy behavior, right? Other things that we can do is be very careful of using metaphor. Sometimes metaphors just become a vehicle for human concerns, and they're only literary as human subjects. If we only look at the purely literary aspects of metaphor, we might marginalize real animals, right? We might trap the animal in terms of what they mean for humans, and we're still kind of looking at them as objects, not as subjects. Or we could use metaphor as a way into animals and unlock them and see the animality of the animal. And we can see perhaps how Monica Ewan does that. The firefly is a metaphor for imagism, but she unlocks the firefly to show, what this amazing insect is and can do, right? And then we could look at standard forms. I've mentioned animal fables, but there's also children's literature. Ortiz-Robley says we could look at animal plots like hunting or the plot of Wild Child. I think of Eva Horning's, that should be Eva Horning's book, Dog Boy, which is about based on a real story of a real boy, a young boy raised by wild dogs in Moscow. Fascinating. This is a fascinating book. Or Ortiz-Robley says you could look at a plot as an animal, like a winding linear plot. I know that cobras are not popular in Brazil, but he says we could compare it to a snake. Or a prickly plot is like a hedgehog, like a porcupine with a lot of spikes. Or an angular plot like a praying mantis who has a body that kind of looks like this. Or a Bildungsroman, German word. Bildungs means development, Roman means novel. The novel about the growth and the life and growth of a character. We could compare it to a butterfly who goes through different stages. Or you could look at how narratives reframe cultural models and or with models with humans at the center. And we could look at how they shore up and reproduce, or that's a good way, reframe cultural models, or look at how they reframe and amplify human-centric understandings of animals. We could reconceive literary history. We could look at how animals have been configured through literature, look at the cultural shifts, look at the continuities as they move through literary works. We could consider texts that reinforce and resist dominant discourses of animality at different historical moments. We could put them in dialogue with each other and ask how far and to what extent did the intertextual relations between animals in one work, genre, or period extend to those of another, right? And then as far as theory goes, we're still at the beginning. We could start to develop theories of animal fables, animal metaphors, zoological poetics that incorporates and builds on the very insights gleaned from the animal term that I'm talking about. We could develop a poetics of species. If you've had literary theory, you might have started with a theory of literary history like Aristotle, who promotes the idea of awe, of wonderment, of how literature gets us to develop that sense of awe, which is a good thing. I mean, I have a friend, I'm going to do an aside, who suffers from depression. And one of the terrible things about depression for any of you who have it, and which is a really hard condition to go through or know someone who has it, is that one of the horrible parts about it is a condition called ahedonia. And hedonia comes from the word, think about hedonistic, where you take pleasure in something. And when you have ahedonia, that means you can't experience pleasure. So literature, you could say, is about, how to get us to feel awe and pleasure and take pleasure in that awe. And look at this lovely passage that I'm going to read by Orhan Pamuk. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2006. He is a Turkish author, and he writes about, he actually features somewhat frequently street dogs. There are a lot of street dogs in Turkey, or Turkey as Turkey likes to be called now, in his novels. Now, street dogs are among the most reviled dogs, creatures across the planet. They get killed, they get marginalized, they suffer a lot. And so here is a passage at the end of Orhan Pamuk's essay, What I Know About Dogs. So here's the quotation. He writes, I open my eyes, just a second, let me take a break here. I opened my eyes and decided that people actually remember very little about dogs. I must have seen tens of thousands of dogs in this world, and when I was looking at them, they struck me as beautiful. The world surprises us in the same way. It is here, there, right next to us. Then it fades and everything turns to nothing. So he has this moment of beauty. The world surprises us, it's here, and then it fades. You can't hang on to that moment. And then we have post-humanist texts that engage with the theoretical problematic of humanism, that deconstructs the human subjects. And then there's cultural material theory, such as the history of the book and its physicality. Think about animals who make the production of literature possible, like quills. People used to write with feathers rather than pens, and now computers, and now cell phones, which no one needs pens anymore. We have our cell phones with us. And then, of course, some stuff was written on animal skin. Right? We can combine animal theory. We can think about disciplinarity, inter, multi, trans, cross-disciplinarity. We can cross over with different disciplines like philosophy, biology, ethology, again, study of animal behavior, psychology, zoology, primatology. All right. So not just look at animals through literature, but combine it with other disciplines in different kinds of ways. All right, I'm a great fan of transdisciplinarity. Let's let the disciplines cross. McHugh says we have a responsibility to be interdisciplinary if we want to do literary animal studies properly. And the McDonald argues that we're living in a dire time with species extinction, climate change, biomedicine, the animal industrial complex, biopolitical power. So she says we have another kind of responsibility, one related to the concerns of the age. And then Edwards et al. Reminds us that as far as doing literary animal theory, that we play a role. We are engaged in the process of meaning making. We are not passive. We actively shape the words on the page in our response to them. Even in the pronouns we use, In Portuguese, there's she and he. In English, we have it, which tends to objectify. I myself now, when I'm talking about animals, I tend to use she and he because that gives animals subjectivity. So we can identify the animal, position it as a subject, or we can impose an identity on it, position it as an object. We can try to see animals as subjects, and we should approach what we're doing with humility and not assume human superiority. So there's our own state of mind, right? And then this is the second to the last slide. What's the position? Very good things are happening here. This one's in English, Animals and Society in Brazil from the 16th to the 19th centuries by Ana Lucia Camfora. And then here, Literature Beyond the Human, Post-Anthropocentric Brazil, edited by, not even reading my own writing, but one of the authors here is out of UERJ, and which I got to visit on my travels. This has been exciting. And here's a new exciting book, which sadly is not translated into English. And I learned about this book last week by Maria Esther Maciel, Animalidades, Zoa Literatura e os Limites do Humano. This one just came out last year. And these are just a few that I found and learned about. So things are happening in Brazil. The fact that you are here, many of you are also doing literary animal studies now. So, concluding thoughts. Animals in literature have been around forever, and that's hence my first question. What is your first memory? They abound in literature across all ages and cultures. Literature itself is one of the oldest of human endeavors. Animals are at the very systems of our representation. They populate, they people our poetic images, they animate our narratives, they turn the wheels of our plots. Even now, even though animals' presence in contemporary literature and contemporary culture seems more marginal, they are still with us, even if they're not as foregrounded. They have been too often hidden in plain sight. So let us pay attention to them. And the activist in me says, let's care about them too. So that is the end of my presentation, this part, and I welcome your questions. So I will remove this from the stage, and I hope to hear from you, your responses, your thoughts, your questions, your ideas. So let me thank you all.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you. What a masterclass. Simply amazing. Thank you so much. And we have some questions for you here in the chat. Let me see. First of all, when you were talking about childhood memories, our favorite animal stories, some people mentioned the Ugly Duckling, Dumbo, and a Brazilian short story by Clarice Lispector, A Mulher que Matou os Peixes, The Woman Who Killed the Fish. We also have a child's story by Clarice Lispector, The Secret Life of Laura, but Laura is a hen in the story. So Clarice Lispector. And also that reminds me of, I don't know if you have checked this out, Clarice Lispector's The Passion According to G.H., in which the character eats a roach in a moment of epiphany. And also, considering our Brazilian references, Gigliane Souza wrote here that she remembered Vidas Secas by Graciliano Ramos, which in English was translated as The Barren Lives, in which there is a story of a family a famished family who lives in the backwoods of the northeast of Brazil. And they have a dog called Baleia, whale. So there is this contrast between whale, the sea, and the backwoods of the northeast of Brazil. So, and then we have here a question from Professor Rogério. He's also a professor here at Acre University. And he has a question. Thank you, Rogério. How can we go, how can we go further than eco themes, thinking about animal representations on literature? Are there any suggestions on transdisciplinary themes we can use in the classroom, for example?
Yes, thank you for that question, Professor Rogério. I think that one of the things I actually, if you can tell, I'm starting to develop a bit of a passion for insects. And so I think that in order to understand them, I think that it kind of behooves us to kind of even bring in biology and ethology to look at how they are represented. And I think poetry does a really beautiful job, and you can spend an entire class on one poem of trying to kind of get to the animality of the animal who is represented. And I think if you bring in ancillary kinds of texts, and they can even you could even start with Wikipedia, that would be useful. But then there are things like, I mean, let's say you want to teach Kafka's Metamorphosis. Everyone wants to say that the bug whom Gregor Samsa is transformed into is a cockroach. And, you know, why are we sort of driven to that kind of specific species? But it wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of understand how, you know, how bugs navigate themselves. There's a ballet that was based on the Metamorphosis, and Mikhail Baryshnikov, one of the great ballet dancers of the 20th century, I don't know if he's still dancing, performed Gregor Samsa on stage. And so I think that there's a lot you can even do with theater and opera and art. I tend in my Animal Planet class to bring in other genres. I'm especially fond of film. There's a really wonderful critic named Akira Lippert who looks at the kinds of brilliant things that filmographers do and how film is used. And graphic film, graphic novels are one of the really great ways to kind of talk about, you know, not just the language, but how animals move, and how, for example, I called Bambi a brilliant movie. It has very few words in it, I think just over 1,000. And that's because the filmmakers try to represent Bambi through movement and gesture. And I've gone on animal safaris, and one of the things that you do is you really pay attention to movement. And I think authors try to capitalize on that movement. So I guess I bring in a background on biology and ethology and so on. And then there are the psychologists and so on, and the primatologists who look at behavior. And I like to bring in other disciplines, all right, other humanities. And then you can be all activists too, like talk about eating animals. And I have a number of friends in the US who are vegans who bring in their activism and look at, you know, why do we eat cows but keep dogs as pets, and bring in those larger socio-political questions and bring in questions of culture. All right. So I think that as far as transdisciplinary, there are so many things that you can do. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Jeanne. Rogério, if you have any further questions, I can ask Professor Jeanne. And now we have a question from Giglione Souza. What about the process of human characters turning into animals, such as Kafka Metamorphosis and Night Bitch from Rachel Yoder? How would this fit in the animals literature, or it wouldn't? This reminds me of The Fly by David Cronenberg too. What do you think?
Animal studies critics love these films. Whatever brings the animal in there, it's an opportunity to talk about animals. Kafka is one of the most, what I keep calling go-to authors, because he also has written about He's written about primates. He writes about humans being animalized. J.M. Coetzee, who was a South African writer, I believe he's moved to Australia. I don't know if he's now a naturalized citizen there, but he has written books, The Lives of Animals, Elizabeth Costello, Disgrace. But I think movies that are about transformation are so, and anything about transformation are so great about talking about the human-animal divide. So whenever you have that opportunity, I mean, next semester, Maria Aparecida and I are going to teach a video conferencing class, which I'll refer to a little bit more with my Animal Planet class, where we'll talk about Animal Farm, to all about personification, right? And so yeah, I mean, it's all good, in other words.
And considering still talking about Gigliani's question, is it possible to think about how, like in animal studies, is it possible to think about how some groups in our society are animalized, like they are not captured by this construct of humanity?
I think that this is extremely important. I did not talk about this, but with colonial literature, because we know that colonizers animalized people as a way of justifying their colonization. Mm-hmm. And I've taught a wonderful book by Dominique Boisseron called Afro Dog. And it's about the way African Americans in the US were not just animalized to justify slavery, but they're still animalized. In the US, over 1,000 people are killed every year by police violence. And the majority of those who are killed are African Americans. And so we can see that kind of animalization taking place. And another really horrible thing is that animals are used in the course of conducting violence by the state, like dogs are. I mean, they have been used as weapons, and they were used as weapons during the age of colonization. You only need to look at the photographs and read the stories. And so I think it's really essential to look at how humans have been animalized in the service of repressing them, and still are, of othering them.
Thank you, Jeanne. And I also think that it refers back to Rogério's question, as in our teaching programs, it's a way of approaching this subject in the classroom for our future teachers, right? Thank you. And we have a question from Caio. Do animal studies necessarily go along with veganism, both in theory, criticism, and in practice, or is it possible to separate both of them, both things?
This is a very important debate. It comes up all the time. I'm not exaggerating. All the time in animal conferences. When I go to animal conferences, and I've been to quite a few, they're not just literary animal conferences. They tend to be multidisciplinary because it's very hard to do animal studies properly without that. And so it comes up. So I've been to a number of conferences where only vegan food is served, because the idea is that if you really are doing animal studies properly, you have to be vegan. But you have to know that we live in a world that depends on animal lives. We take medicine and we use products that are tested on animals. We can't get away from our exploitation. We build buildings that are not conducive to animal life, like buildings with windows into which birds fly. Our infrastructure is inherently anti-animal. Anytime you build a road, you're killing off animals. Any road, all roads are bad without exception, even when they build crossings into them. So our lives are kind of premised on the death of animals. And those of us in the global north, global west, I mean, one can argue that indigenous peoples have lived in a much more harmonious way. And that takes us into another form of animal studies, is looking at the different kinds of relationships and how those are premised. Now, then there are those, like Donna Haraway says, hey, we're at the top of the food chain. We eat animals. And so that's how it is. There are others like Jonathan Safran Foer, who say, it's really hard to break away from culture. I know that Brazil is a big animal flesh eating culture. So is the US. As people become more prosperous around the world, they want to eat more animals. It signifies their status in the world. You have to look at culture. But I do have a number of vegan friends who say, how can you do animal studies and eat animals? You can't. So you should know, Kaya, that there are so many debates on this topic, and I'm only giving you a handful.
Excellent, Jeanne. Thank you. Food for thought. We have a question from Professor Carolina Mesquita. How are animal studies intertwined with the study of narratives in literature by indigenous originary peoples, especially those related to cosmology?
Fortunately, there is a growing body. I myself, when I teach my course, Animal Planet, it tends to be designed for non-literature majors, so I don't get to teach as much literature as I want. But I do teach works by anthropologists who study indigenous peoples. Of course, anthropologists study corporate life and they study all manner of life. But there's such an important body of critical work done on indigenous peoples. Also, that's about decentering an ethnocentric canon that is premised on literature by people in the global Northwest and the global West. And so I think that when we teach literature, I know when I used to teach a lot of introductory literature courses, I taught basically world literature courses, and my texts were not all by those from the standard canon, but I would try to, I wouldn't just try, I would bring in more text and songs and so on. So animal studies, I think, is deeply, many in animal studies are deeply interested in the question of indigenous representations. Yeah. And of course, you get into art too, and music and artifacts. And you can see how hard it is to kind of separate out literary animal studies from other, ways of doing animal studies. I mean, with this seminar, I was focused on the literary, but I think it's really hard to kind of say, okay, this is what we do in literature. That's what they do in art. That's what they do in film. They kind of, become intertwined with one another.
Thank you. And Jeanne, I believe, I don't know if you agree, that considering Carol's question about indigenous peoples and animal studies, I was also thinking about queer studies based on my previous comment related to how some groups are not captured by this hegemonic idea of humanity, right? And I was thinking about that, especially when we consider fantastic realism, in which animal images are used to represent some groups. For example, a book by an Argentinian writer, trans writer, Camila Sosa Villada, and she uses images of animals in order to represent these groups of trans women who are not considered part of that society in Cordoba, Argentina. And now I remember that, and I think it's a good take to consider.
Yeah, can I follow up on the cosmology part? Let's not ignore cosmology. I mean, I think that Yoon's point where she talks about the different zones, I mean, I think we can embroider that word zones and think about people like the poets like John Donne, British from the 17th century, who looks at how the world is contained within an insect. And so Virginia Woolf does that in her beautiful essay, The Death of the Moth. She brings in both cosmology, cosmography, and the single insect. And so this is one of the joys of being in literary studies, is it allows us to do that. And then as far as queer goes, there's a wonderful article in the New York Times Magazine, which I like to teach. It's titled, Are They Queer? And it's about, and if you want me to send it to you, just email me and I'll send it to you. But it's about this idea that animals are not, they're not all quote unquote heterosexual. They just like us humans sweep across the range of sexuality. And when you look at ethology, animal behavior, you can just do very cool things with that and queerness and, animals as inherently queer. And I mean, look at our dogs. I mean, do we not have dogs who hump our legs, whether they're female or male? And we say, no, you can't do that. You're among humans. We train them not to do that, but they do it. They don't just cross the gender, the sexuality divide. They cross the species divide. All right, transspecial, transsexual creatures that they are. And then there's an artist.
Boundaries, right?
Yeah, there's an artist named Sue Coe who represents herself putting her cat's head in her mouth and embracing her cat, saying she's constantly crossing species divides and sexual divides. So all kinds of great things you could do there.
That's very interesting because these are our boundaries, not the animals' boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And I'm really interested in this text. I would like to read it.
Okay, all right. If I don't send it to you by tonight, remind me and I'll hunt it down. Let me just
Thank you so much. Thank you. Another question from Marilia. Professor Dubino, thinking of examples like Flush, how do you see the intersection of animal studies and life writing enhancing or our understanding of both fields?
Because their lives affect us and our lives affect theirs. And Flush is so beautiful because it shows how difficult it is to be a pet dog. Flush is living in the lap of luxury. He gets to drink and eat out of a purple bowl. We know that purple is the color of royalty. Of course, purple, and at least in the US, also represents being a lesbian. And I wonder if that was the case when Wolf wrote Flush. But anyway, I think that Wolf so beautifully shows how hard it is to be a dog. Like Flush's happiness depends on Elizabeth Barrett Browning's. And if she rejects him, he takes it so personally. And think about, for those of you who have dogs, when you leave the house, your dogs are bereft because their happiness is so dependent on yours. They watch us. They're so, in a way, nervous and anxious because they look at us for clues. And so I think that just reading about life writing, the representation of dogs, gets us to understand what it's like to be a dog. And then as humans, our lives are more circumscribed. If you have another creature in your house, you have an obligation to look after that creature. And you learn maybe what it's like to accommodate another being. Just like if you have children or you live with other people, you're always making compromises, but you make different kinds of compromises. So there's nothing like life writing that's well done to get us to kind of see that. And I know that it's not popular in Brazil. I learned that. But in the US, it's not uncommon for people to have cobras as pets, snakes. And so you learn about, what it's like to be a snake or a rat. That's not an uncommon pet. Apparently, there's this global treaty called the Convention Against the Illegal Trafficking of Animals, which is a good treaty, but unfortunately, animals are trafficked, and the U.S. is one of the leading violators of this international law. But we sure do have a lot of exotic pets to show for it. And I personally don't think we should keep any other creatures as pets except for domesticated pets because it's not fair. I mean, animals need their lives. But anyway, people write about this and you can learn about, what it's like. And you can learn about, I think, even about farm animals. I mean, you can learn about chickens and, other kinds of creatures. So I think that we learn from each other. I mean, that's just one answer.
Thank you, Jeanne. Just to check some compliments. from Lauro. Thank you, Jeanne, for a wonderful presentation. And then you can drink some water. A comment about Kafka, which could give us like a whole session about this book, right?
Yes, and let me say that there are many books on Kafka. He is so popular, and of course, those of us in literary modernist studies love him, and we don't have to be in literary modernism. We could just read him and love him at pretty much any level, but there are many. Yeah.
Very good. And then we have a question from Xiaodian. How can we use animals in children's literature classes in ways to make kids participate, I believe?
Well, as it turns out, the one way to teach, as the global north became more industrialized at the beginning of the 19th century and of the 18th century, a whole body of literature was developed, children's literature. And so much children's literature, even now, features animals. And there are studies after studies of children's literature. Like my husband, Andrew, writes about Maria Edgeworth, who lived, an Irish author, novelist, who lived at the end of the 18th into the 19th century. And she wrote a lot of children's literature. And children's literature is not just about getting children to read. It's about making them empathic and good human beings. How to be kind to animals tends to be the major theme. And what some people will say is children's first experiences with literature are about teaching them how to be kind. Why do they forget that lesson as soon as they become adults and forget about being kind to animals? And so why do they break that connection? And so there's a whole body of literature about that. So, and in the US, there are, in education departments, there are classes on children's literature and of course, whole classes on young adult literature. That's something that my husband likes to teach a lot. He loves young adult literature, he likes to read it. But he, now that he's married to me and I talk about animals all the time, he's gotten into animals. And so he tries to feature in his classes as many texts as he can about animals so that he can kind of slip in animal studies and courses that are not about animal studies.
Excellent.
By the way, that's one thing you can do. If you don't teach animal studies classes and you want to, you can insert class texts that are about animals, even if the whole class is mostly about literary modernism or Victorian literature or, 20th century Brazilian literature.
Yes, I agree with you. I taught a course on children's literature last semester, and we talked about some stories in which animals played an important role, including fairy tales, right, in general. And there is a question now related to that for us teachers from Astorigi. Hi, Jeanne, great lecture about a very interesting theme. So my question is, do you think that Aesop's fables have influenced your research?
Well, it just turns out, Astorige? It turns out that I have a dear friend named Cowrie who is very interested in the question of fables. So she asked me to participate in a symposium on animal fables. And I said, well, I might do literary animal studies, but I have actually never written about the fables or done them. So then I got really interested in the fable as a genre. And I reread Aesop's fables because, let me go now to how did I become a PhD in literature. My first experience with literature was reading fairy tales and fables, and they made me love literature. And so that's back when I was 7 years old. So now I feel like I'm returning to something that was very formative in my choice of my life career. So I went to some short stories and I realized how much they were based on the genre of the fable. But where the fable is kind of, Aesop's fables are kind of more about might makes right. The stories I looked at by an Iranian author, an Indian author, and then Orhan Pamuk were more about how contemporary fables are about eliciting sympathy and compassion on the part of the reader. So I look at neo-fables. And Cowrie actually is sponsoring a conference that's open to the entire globe. It's open, it's free. And if you are interested in fables, please email me and I'll send you the link, because she would love to have, people attend and if possible, participate. And I think this is a global conference, and Kaori Nagai, and I think she would love to have more participation as well. But she has done so much to kind of popularize and get many of us who are in animal studies but haven't properly worked with the genre to become interested.
Thank you. And there is a continuation for this question. And do you think that those stories are the original source for the literary animal studies?
I think they're one of the sources. I think it has a lot to do with disappearing animals. I think it has to do, my hypothesis is that it has to do with the widening sphere of sympathy. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the rights movement. I think it has a lot to do with the world out there. People are starting to care, and then the literary world responds to that. But fables, sure, I think they have something to do with it. But I think there are bigger events. There are big events going on outside that have made their way into literary studies. Like, I'll talk tomorrow about the disability rights movement percolated its way into literary studies. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeanne. So we are coming to an end, and we have some comments here from Carol, from Rogério, Marília, and from Professor Maísa Dourado, who helped me organize this event.
Thank you so much, Professor Maísa. Thank you.
And then we are coming to an end, and I would like you to make a suggestion for us, since tomorrow we have another theme. If you could suggest your favorite book in which animal plays an important part, or movie, something to finish our session today.
Well, you can tell I keep referring to Flush, all right? But there's another beautiful book that is by a U.S. author who just passed, Paul Auster. He wrote a pretty wonderful book about a street dog and a street person, a person who is homeless, called Timbuktu, a beautifully written, poignant book. As far as movies go, the movie Blackfish has done so much to raise awareness of what we do to the large fish in our oceans. We humans have killed off 90% of all large fish since 1950. We need to be aware of that. I think that movies can play popular movies, not just documentaries. But let's never forget the role of popular literature and popular movies. Yes, we look at them from an aesthetic, critical perspective, but they can play an activist role as well. So those are just two of the ones that come to the top of my head, and I will think of more. And you heard me talk about Bambi, which is a beautiful movie about what it means to be a faun. Let's not underestimate the power of graphic fiction. I love the book Laika, all right, by Nick Abadzis, Abadzis, a U.S. Graphic novelist, Laika, which is about the Soviet space dog. An incredible book. I love that book. And it also is about globalization, the US-Soviet space race, the use of animals in research. Such a great book. I know these are all dog books. I know there are cat books too, but you can see the speciesism, my speciesism, where I keep valuing dogs at the top of the list. But that's probably because I'm also in dog studies. I'm teaching a course next semester called Global Dogs. So I've got dogs at the top of my head. So those are just some of them.
Thank you. And we also have this reference, which I talked about. Barren Lives, by Graciliano Ramos, and this book, everybody who has read, let me, right here. And it's common sense. Everybody who read this book got traumatized some way. And it's also a dog book, and this dog's called Whale, Baleia. So I hope you enjoy. So I also have leave here a Brazilian suggestion, and I hope you enjoy it. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. So I would like to invite Maria Oliveira on stage to finish our session today. So Maria is responsible for making this happen. She used to be a teacher, a professor here at the Federal University of Acre, and today she is in Paraíba, and she's a great friend of mine. She's a person I look up to so incredibly much. She's an amazing professor, an amazing friend. So thank you, Maria, for being here. So, all yours.
Thank you, Jeanne, also, and thank you, Victor, very much for organizing this event, and it was really amazing. All the time I was thinking about Guimarães Rosa, Gran Sertão Veredas, and also Sagarana. In Sagarana, we have Conversa de Bois, and we have Burrinho Pedres, and all over the book, it's full of animals, and it's a great representation of animals in Brazilian literature. So it's really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria, for this amazing recommendation. So our last comments here from Gigliani, from Professor Bruna. Here, tomorrow, we have more classes with Jeanne Dubino. So, Professor Jeanne Dubino, thank you so much for this amazing masterclass on animal studies. It was amazing, an enlightening session, as Carol Mesquita said. And tomorrow, guys, I'm going to speak in Portuguese to help some students here. And Maísa misses you, Maria.
Yes, I would like also to thank Maísa, Victor, and it's so good to see some of my students there, like Jeanne, and also Professor Bruna, Rogério. It's a great pleasure to see you guys, even if it's online. Thank you so much. I like Acre very much. Thank you.
Então, pessoal, para finalizar, amanhã, às 8 horas da manhã, horário do Acre, e às 10 horas da manhã, horário de Brasília, nós teremos a nossa segunda aula com a professora Jeanne Dubino, que vai falar sobre disabilities in literature. Então, espero todos vocês amanhã, e gostaria de lembrá-los que, para obter a certificação, tem que comparecer a pelo menos 2 sessions, okay? So, Maria, Professor Jeanne Dubino, thank you so much, and we see you all tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Maísa.